30
So
years.
in this scenario, what happens to CBC News? Does it disappear? Television news?
No,
It
it ought not to. But it needs to fix itself, as I've said. It has not just an audience problem; it has a non-audience problem of people that have decided to turn it off because it doesn't speak to them.
We have breaking but unsurprising news. A new federal research report is raising fresh questions about Canadians' trust in the mainstream media. But this isn't a new problem. Repeated CRTC polling has actually shown weak confidence in Canadian news organizations for years, and testimony before a Senate committee back in 2024 was already sounding the alarm long before this story even broke. Let's take a look. Ladies and gentlemen, from the Western Standard, federal research shows Canadians increasingly distrust CBC, mainstream media over political bias. Blacklock's reporter also broke the same story. Canadians are increasingly skeptical of the CBC and other mainstream news outlets, with federal research finding many believe media organizations report the news with an quote-unquote angle or agenda and a quote-unquote particular political slant. Blacklock's reporter says the research also found some Canadians are turning to Reddit, YouTube, and podcasts rather than relying on television networks and newspapers for news and information. Quote, participants across all groups demonstrated significant skepticism toward individual sources of news and current affairs, emphasizing the importance of cross-referencing multiple sources, end quote, said a March 18th report released Saturday. The findings came from 14 focus groups commissioned by the Department of Immigration. The department spent $119,802 on research conducted by Toronto-based pollster Ipsos. Traditional outlets, including CBC, CTV, and major newspapers, remained relevant to some participants who valued professional journalism and quote-unquote rigorous fact-checking, according to the 2026 IRCC Annual Tracking Focus Groups report. However, even participants who relied on traditional media said it was important to be quote-unquote wary of who it's coming from and what is the kind of angle or agenda. So isn't this interesting? So it's already being framed in this report that if you don't watch mainstream media, if you don't watch CBC, and if you don't watch CTV, then you're not interested in rigorous fact-checking. Isn't that interesting, folks? But we actually were able to find some different reports related to this. The actual report that they're talking about, it doesn't even seem to be published yet. So at least as far as we can find, it looks like Blacklock's got their hands on this the back doorway. Anyhow, we found some polling back a couple years ago from CRTC that draws very, very similar conclusions. Check this out. So this is a report that actually was completed in October of 2023, and it's the CRTC Public Opinion Research Tracker Baseline Survey. Here's one section of it. Attitudes towards Canadian content, specifically, are generally positive but soft. While most feel it is at least somewhat important to have access to Canadian-made programming and that they rely on Canadian news media to understand the world, Canadians' impressions of the quality, variety, and depth of content, as well as trust in media, are relatively weak, and most do not feel reflected in the types of programming available or that it is relevant to their lives. So check out these stats. Roughly 4 in 10 agree that it is important for them to have access to Canadian-made television programs, 41%, and music, 38%, and are satisfied with the quality and variety of Canadian music available today, 39% each. Closer to 1/3 are satisfied with the quality. And you know, it's interesting the way this is written, because it's kind of trying to portray this as a positive. Closer to 1/3 are satisfied with the quality, 35%, which means 65% are not necessarily satisfied with quality. And variety, 34% of Canadian television programs agree that the types of news, music, and television programming are relevant to their lives. 36%, or that they see themselves reflected in the programming available, 32%. Nearly half rely on Canadian news media to help them understand what's going on in the world, 45%, and that news programming covers a diverse range of topics and issues, 41%. Fewer agree that they trust the information provided by news media in Canada, 36%. And that the types of news programming offers a variety of perspectives, 36%. And that they are satisfied the quality of information and analysis offered by Canadian news media, 37%. Those are very, very poor numbers, folks. Can you imagine if you answered only 1/3 of the questions on your final exam and you went up to the professor and you said, "Hey, professor, I managed to answer 1/3 of the questions on my final exam." Do you think you're going to get a positive or negative response? Do you think you're going to get a passing grade or a failing grade from your professor? I think we all know the answer. Here's the actual stats that are broken down from here. So the blue is they actually agree with what the questions are saying. One of the most significant questions on this is actually the bottom one. I am satisfied with the quality of information and depth of analysis offered by Canadian news media. 37%, folks. The most significant stat on this page reflects what we said before. I trust the information provided by news media in Canada to be accurate and impartial. 36%. So that was almost 3 years ago, right? October 2023. CRTC knew this. Now we're going to go to a Senate committee hearing in 2024. And this is from a former ombudsman at the CBC. Okay, his name is Kirk Lapointe. So this is a guy who used to work at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I just want to make sure that everyone understands the context here, because this is not just somebody who's going to be railing against the CBC because they hate the CBC. This person worked there. This is what he had to say at this committee.
Suffering an all-time low in trustworthiness with the public. There are some good reasons for this. When media fail to hold institutions accountable or make mistakes of omission or commission in the stories and themes they cover. And CBC News has its own set of problems because more is expected of it as a representative for all Canadians and not just slices of the Canadian market. I believe it's lost some of its stature because it's lost some of its way. It has not found the recipe in its journalism to satisfy the Canadian mainstream as it contended with the important challenge of broadening its representation of our country. It appears to have emphasized diversity of portrayal over diversity of perspectives. And in doing so, it's only traded an earlier version of alienating audiences for a new version. This has opened a very vulnerable flank for the corporation and built an opportunity for its opponents to call for its defunding. I've argued that CBC needs to be fixed, not nixed, and that its critics' view that it serves as a mouthpiece for the federal government is ludicrous and ill-informed. As an avid consumer of news, I can vouch that many of the most assertive investigative pieces on this government and on previous governments of all stripes were created in its newsrooms. But its antagonists are not all wrong, and CBC has to be more open to tackle their critique that their services are not thorough in their perspectives and thus not sufficient value for their money.
All right, so the first part. It's interesting what he says. So he says that they're more interested in a diversity of portrayal rather than a diversity of perspectives. What does that mean? What that means is that they're interested in telling the same story 5 different ways, but they're not interested in having 5 different perspectives on that same story. Meaning, here's the view from the left-leaning angle, here's the view from the right-leaning angle, here's the view from the centrist angle, here's the view from the far left and the far right. That would be more valuable to Canadians to actually see what's going on. And this is what journalists are supposed to do. They're supposed to say, here's all of the facts. These are not in dispute. Good, bad, or ugly, here's all the facts. And then, this is what commentator shows are for. this is where they bring on people from these different perspectives to actually give their take on what's going on. And this is where you'll have, or you're supposed to have, competing views. This is what allegedly these panels are for when you look at CBC and CTV and Global. But more and more and more, not a lot of people have a strong disagreement with each other. And if not a lot of people have a strong disagreement with each other, then that means you're just getting a diversity in the portrayal of the speakers rather than the perspectives of the speakers. And this is what he's talking about. And he even says, again, he's not a right-wing conservative. You can tell, because he disagrees with a lot of the criticism. He disagrees with CBC needing to be defunded. That's his own opinion. But he acknowledges that there is something broken, and he says that CBC lost their way.
And I'm not suggesting that CBC start talking about denying climate change or dismissing the importance of Indigenous reconciliation or that large audience now that public opinion polls suggest will result in a shift in the government sometime in the next year. And I think that it's, in a way, it's hurt itself in doing so, by virtue of just not keeping track of the change that was going on in the country and not somehow satisfying, whether it's on economic issues or in some cases on social issues, and giving them some credence. And I'm not suggesting that CBC start talking about denying climate change or dismissing the importance of Indigenous reconciliation or the prime importance of bringing more people to this country in order to, frankly, benefit our country. None of that's the issue. It's the kind of fiscal conservative piece that most Canadians hold right now, that polls would show is one of the overwhelming reasons why there is a dissatisfaction with this government and an openness to entertaining an option later next year, 30 years.
So in this scenario, what happens to CBC News? Does it disappear? Television news?
No, it ought not to. But it needs to fix itself, as I've said. It has not just an audience problem; it has a non-audience problem of people that have decided to turn it off because it doesn't speak to them. And I will concede that my generation of manager did a very poor job in speaking to the wider part of Canada. That it was very narrowly focused, and as a result, it cost us, I think, large audiences in this country. I think we're doing better at as journalists now in having newsrooms that have diversity and find the stories that a wider range of Canadians would like. But we have not come along at the same time by being as open about the perspectives that people bring to those stories and the themes that they wish pursued. I think we're kind of halfway there, and I think that speaks to what CBC News specifically has to address in its markets. Like I say, I can speak in Vancouver. I could talk about Toronto. I know quite a bit about the Albertan market and Ottawa, but I think it's at the heart of why it is that the CBC is being pummeled politically right now, and I think it doesn't have a whole lot of time left to fix itself here before bad things happen.
So it's Kirk LaPointe essentially saying CBC is on its last legs. How can you argue? We ended up breaking that report that showed CBC's own financials are abysmal. Their advertising is tanking because people aren't watching them, and it's going down and down and down. So you have a former CBC ombudsman who you can tell that he loves the CBC. He loves the historic aspect of the CBC, but he's acknowledging that there's something very rotten and very broken inside the CBC that they have to fix it. We have the CRTC report from 2023. We have this report that was being referenced in the Western Standard that is dropping or was released on Saturday. It's not published online yet. But we also have the latest CRTC baseline report. And this is important because it's almost the same. It's a little structurally different, but it's a very, very similar report than the 2023 one. So now we can do apples to apples instead of apples to oranges. So here it is. This was actually released on December 12th, 2025. And this ended up costing roughly $250,000. And this went to Ipsos as well. So they're making good on these reports. Here you go. Second from the bottom and third from the bottom, folks. These are actually lower scores by 1% each than the previous report. I am satisfied with the quality of information and depth of analysis offered by Canadian news outlets. 36%. I trust the information provided by news media in Canada to be accurate and impartial. 35%. So it's actually gone down. So this is the narrative for that section. So it's attitudes toward broadcasting, but it's buried a lot more. And they don't really call out that there's, a weakness and it's softening and this type of thing. All they say is this: the quality of information and depth of analysis offered by Canadian news organizations, 36%, and trust the information provided by Canadian news media to be accurate and impartial, 35%. So they're just saying 1 in 3. 1 in 3 is saying that, but it's gone down over the last 2 years since that report was out. And then we have this report that's breaking now. So what does this say to us? Well, as we say in polling, one data point is one data point. It's one point in time. But we have 2023, 2024, 2025, and now 2026. Ladies and gentlemen, you have 4 different data points here from 3 different sources: CRTC, immigration, and a former ombudsman that used to work at CBC. So the conclusion here is what I think a lot of Canadians already know, that Canadians don't trust the mainstream media. That's a problem. Because the mainstream media, the news, as it were, we've said this time and time again, they are the guardians at the gates when it comes to our democracy. They're supposed to be holding this government to account. They're supposed to be calling them out when they lie to the Canadian public. They're supposed to be challenging them on legislation that's not good for the Canadian public. They're supposed to be getting Canadians the facts so we know what's going on. They're literally paid to do this because Canadians are too busy working at their jobs trying to keep society going. And the news is supposed to keep us informed. But now there's this saying, right? If you don't watch the news, you're uninformed. If you watch the news, you're misinformed. That's the sad state. So is it any wonder that Canadians are turning to other sources because they don't trust them? And why would they? More and more, we're seeing that they're spin and spin and spin, and they hold the Conservatives to more account than they do to the actual government in power. When the Conservatives don't have any power to affect anything in this country except propose private member bills. And now that Mark Carney's manufactured his majority, that the mainstream media doesn't even want to reference, they don't have the power with the other opposition parties to do what they did with the last Trudeau government. So this is where we are. But it's amazing that there's a government report now. Well, three government reports that are now talking about this. The question is CBC going to talk about this?